There are some things video games often do well, and some they don't. Mount & Blade Warband, however, is a game that excels at the things most other games do badly. And that might be why Tailword Entertainment's action-oriented role-playing/strategy/simulation game is still so popular 10 years after its original release. If you've ever wanted to experience being a part of a big battle, charging into enemy lines, cutting down assailants atop a city's walls, or leading your men as you try to storm an enemy castle, well, no other game does this as well as Mount & Blade. Where other titles might show you battles with a handful of NPCs that they try to pass off as major battlefields, or instead take the opposite approach and nail the visuals while providing gameplay that is restrictive and linear, Mount & Blade instead gives you the best of both worlds, with battles of up to 150 functioning and mostly realistically behaving NPCs all on screen at once at a very acceptable frame rate. And it's glorious. The chaos, the shouting, the hails of arrows, the cavalry charges, the shouting, the sound of sword on steel and flesh, and the shouting, and... Okay, maybe a little too much shouting now that I think about it, but really, unlike so many games, these battles just feel like they're supposed to, and that's reason alone why Mount & Blade is worth experiencing. Still, it's hardly the only reason. With a deep, open-ended medieval sandbox that provides a huge amount of player choice and replayability, as well as player-driven storytelling and satisfying progression systems, Mount & Blade can provide hundreds of hours of enjoyment, and that's before even getting into the topic of mods and multiplayer. The experience can be uneven, and that unevenness can be frustrating at times, but even so, much about this game still stands as a landmark achievement in game design that's virtually unrivaled in so many ways, and it doesn't feel like an exaggeration to say that this is one of the best PC games from the last decade. Although, reviewers at the time certainly didn't think so. The original Mount & Blade received a score of 72 on Metacritic. Mount & Blade Warband, which was effectively a definitive edition of the first game with a few new added features like multiplayer that released 2 years later, did a little better with a score of 78, but that still hardly feels like a fair reflection of what this game is, and the console ports did even worse. So reviewers didn't exactly take to it, and yet Mount & Blade developed one of the most passionate fanbases in gaming. It's still one of the highest rated games of all time on Steam, with over 100,000 positive user reviews, and it maintains a pretty active player base to this day, because even 10 years later, what this game offers is still something you can't really find anywhere else. And all this from the debut title of a small independent developer in Turkey. So why did fans love this game so much? Why couldn't reviewers understand the appeal? And why, beyond just having lots of NPCs on screen at once, all shouting at the same time, is this game's legacy quite so enduring and important? Well, to understand that, you need to understand the journey. You see, before you can be a feared general leading great armies, or a recently crowned king ruling newly conquered lands, one must start somewhere a bit more humble. As a penniless nobody with no men, no skill, and no respect. Which sounds a bit like real life. But unlike real life, you get to decide what kind of penniless nobody you get to be. Character creation offers a range of choices about your background, which will impact your starting stats, skills, and equipment, as well as occasionally the way other people will treat you. If you want to hang with the nobles and party like it's 1335, it helps to come from noble stock yourself. However, even more important than whether you're a mudblood or not, is whether you're a woman. And here, when selecting your gender, you see an important lesson about Mount & Blade's entire philosophy. This game is historically realistic, which is not the same as being historically accurate, as the setting is fictional, but this means this is a world where commanding armies and charging in to die for your commander is a job for men. So it is better to make your character male in Mount & Blade, because if you want to lead a warband, it is better to be a man in the world of Mount & Blade. Being a woman puts you at a disadvantage by making it harder to gain land and respect from others. Balance and fairness don't even come into the equation, and you're going to see that in other parts of the game too. But where some games in this situation would therefore not bother with presenting the player with a choice for their gender, Mount & Blade still does, because player choice is paramount to the Mount & Blade experience. And so you can play as a woman, if you choose. And while the downsides to this aren't small, they really aren't overwhelming either, because while Mount & Blade is committed to the idea of historical realism, it's not committed to the point where it wants to diminish players' fun and severely punish the player for their choice in something like gender. So we can see a simple hierarchy here, with player choice being the most important, which is second to historical realism, with balance/fairness coming in last. And this simple hierarchy tells you a lot about the design philosophy behind this game. You can see this in other areas too, but for now, let's get back to the beginning. With your character created, Warband will throw you into a simple questline where a local merchant wants you to track down some bandit or brigand or other such generic troublemaker. Don't be misled by this, however. This is not the start of some epic storyline. Its only real purpose is as a tutorial to give the player at least one structured objective before you're officially set free to do as you please in the fictional world of Calradia. For the rest of the game, there is no set objective and no main storyline. Your reasons for doing things are the reasons you make yourself. This may mean new players might feel a little lost after the game's opening, as players are giving plenty of options and almost no guidance. But before long, things will start to fall into place, so you needn't worry too much, just get out there. After all, you start the game with almost nothing, so the only real direction is upwards as you begin on your path to greatness. Unless you end up as someone's prisoner and get thrown in jail, but at least then you won't have to worry about too much freedom. But mostly, whatever you do, you'll start making progress, whether in the form of money, reputation, or experience points, and you'll find the reasons for doing things will come to you, which gets us back to the storyline or lack thereof. The absence of a main storyline is actually one of the things reviewers criticised about Mount & Blade. People expect a main storyline, particularly for an RPG at the time of release. But the thing is, Sandbox experiences do have stories, they're just of a different kind. Take one of the best examples of a Sandbox game, Dwarf Fortress, where the stories that come from that game are one of the best known things about it, and manage to be popular with people who don't even play the game itself. And that's because a game doesn't have to tell the player a set storyline in order to create stories. It's enough to give the player a set of tools and the space to play around with them, and then let the player add their own details, to use their imagination to fill in the blanks, and to decide for themselves what meaning things have through context rather than exposition. This approach may not appeal to everyone equally, but it's stupid to claim that this is somehow invalid just because it goes against the norm of most RPGs, and when you consider that player freedom is at the heart of Mount & Blade, this approach makes perfect sense. It also probably made a lot of financial sense. If a main story has voice acting, animated character models and cinematic cutscenes, well, all of those things have substantial costs, and by foregoing a main story completely, Mount & Blade's developers were able to focus their limited funds on what did matter to them, the combat and the sandbox itself. A lot of your time in Mount & Blade will be spent in the Overworld. Here you can travel Calradia, moving from town to town or picking fights with enemies you see on the map. When you reach a town or enemy, you'll be met with menus. This means that visually some parts of Mount & Blade aren't all that impressive. The UI is serviceable but lacks flair, the character models are dated, and the overworld itself looks a little barren. However, you can walk around locations such as main cities or villages, and the environments themselves, while admittedly dated by today's standards, are often quite well made. Locations are varied with a keen attention given to realism, which creates a strong sense of identity. All castles and cities are also unique, which goes a long way towards making each location and siege battle feel memorable. Being able to walk around these places adds a lot to the world building, and I'm glad this feature was included, instead of having everything outside of combat just being menu based. However, it must be said that looking for village elders or guild masters who don't stand in obviously noticeable locations can be very annoying and time consuming, and an option to skip straight to speaking with these characters on a location's main menu would have been a helpful quality of life feature. Outside of towns and the overworld, there is of course combat itself. and it's here that the criticisms of Mount & Blade's visuals don't really hold up. Because while even if individually character models don't look very good, when there are 70 of them next to each other, how they look individually doesn't matter as much, and seeing a battlefield full of varied units all doing their own thing is a sight to behold. By 2010 standards, this is not a bad looking game, and the sheer scale of some of the combat scenes you'll find yourself in really feels impressive. But there is, of course, more to combat than visual spectacle. There's also the shouting, and the gameplay. Mount & Blade's combat is one of its best features, and at its core it's surprisingly simple. You can attack in 4 different directions based on mouse movement and left clicking. You can hold left click to charge up an attack, although this is more done to control the timing than to increase damage. And you can also right click to defend. With a shield this blocks automatically, but with a weapon you need to block in the correct direction to parry an opponent's swing, making combat without a shield actually a lot more interesting than with a shield. There's also ranged weapons which function just like most games, but that's it, that's all there is to combat. The skill and complexity mostly come from timing and positioning. Swinging at someone is easy, hitting them is slightly harder, and hitting someone without being hit by someone else is slightly harder still, but it's all still fairly easy, until you add the mount into the mix. A bit like with big battles, lots of games have mounted combat, but very few of them do it well. Mount & Blade is the exception. Your horse feels weighty and its momentum makes it challenging to control with precision, but it's not so difficult to control that it feels clumsy. Therefore, you can maneuver about fairly comfortably, but doing that while hitting enemies is a lot harder. Slow down and this becomes easier, but you'll be an easy target for enemy attacks, and can get stuck in dangerous melee engagements with groups of opponents. Meanwhile, going quick is incentivized both through bonus damage and the ability to charge through enemies, but hitting people becomes much more difficult and more rewarding. When you first start out, you'll be swinging and missing all over the place, but with time you'll be mowing down men with precision, and it will feel good. On the default settings, players can take damage very rapidly, which is good at both keeping players on their toes, taking battles seriously, but also helps in creating that feeling of just being one person on a battlefield. Albeit one with more skill and hopefully better gear than anyone else, but still just one guy out of many who's only a few well-placed arrows or clumsy horse maneuvers away from a quick death. This means there's a sense of player skill to things, both in timing your attacks and being aware of the rest of the battlefield to avoid costly mistakes, which keeps fights interesting. So combat itself is quite simple but still fun. The sound of a successful attack is undeniably satisfying, and the spectacle of being part of a large-scale conflict never gets old, even if the shouting does. But there is still one last part of the combat system that ties things together, which is being able to issue commands to your units to add an element of tactical control to the proceedings. This is done through using the number keys to select the unit type, followed by an F key to issue a command. And while this feels a little cumbersome to do in the midst of battle initially, you'll quickly get used to it, making this system a good addition to the game's combat. You can't micromanage your troops to a really high degree, but a few simple and well thought out commands can significantly increase your chances of victory or minimize your casualties. Basic things like ordering your units to hold a position and telling your infantry to get in front of your archers will allow you to defend strategic positions like hilltops, or just sit back to capitalize on a ranged advantage while preventing your cavalry from suicidally charging too far ahead of everyone else. The player themselves can experiment with their own actions to add to this. You can lead your cavalry to flank around the opposition to hit their ranged units directly, or just run off on your own to try and bait the enemy ranged attackers into focusing you, a fast moving single target, rather than your stationary big block of infantry. Simple strategies like this can be effective and allow you to influence combat through tactical decisions, but the downside to this is that the AI will always act in a similar fashion, meaning you can just rely on the same few tactics over and over, with the only things forcing you to vary your approach being the terrain and enemy composition. So there are limits to the depth of the combat system, but that doesn't mean it's not very enjoyable. And even after 100 hours of gameplay, cutting down enemies in the open field of battle never really feels boring. And once you start to get a taste of battle, you'll quickly get a taste of something else. excessive shouting, and also progression. With victory comes loot, coin, and some other stuff. There are other ways to make money early. You can enter and win tournaments, trade goods from city to city, raid innocent villages, or complete a range of basic quests given to you from lords, guild masters, and village elders, but still, there is one way above all others when it comes to earning coin early on, which is just like in real life, by capturing prisoners through victory in battle and then selling them into slavery at your local tavern. And with money starting to roll in through the legal exchange of freshly indentured servants, you can start to expand your jolly band of men into a well-trained troop of disciplined soldiers. You will generally be recruiting volunteers by passing through villages and then upgrading them into different units as they gain experience points through combat and training. The location of the village will determine what unit tree you have access to, with each of the 6 major factions having their own different units that you can mix and match as you wish. Although you will have to keep an eye on unit morale if you end up sending your troops into war with their original faction. In addition to basic units, you can also recruit companions, who are unique NPCs that can be found in various cities. These companions have fairly basic personalities, and they also like to argue amongst each other if you have companions who don't get along. This happens frequently and will lead to them storming off after a while, which is hardly ideal, although you can find them later and just recruit them again. You can also circumvent all this by looking up which companions dislike others to create a stable party. But overall, the companion happiness system feels a bit too rigid in how it forces you to use certain setups, because your actual in-game actions have a far lower impact on a companion's happiness than just being in the same group as another companion they're predetermined to dislike. Still, while your companions might be volatile in their relationships, you'll still want to keep them around because their skills more than make up for their theatrics. Which brings us to Mount & Blade's skill system. You have 4 main attributes: strength, dexterity, intelligence, and charisma, which each give their own bonus, and then there's a number of skills of various effects that are each connected to a specific attribute. How high you can raise each skill is determined by the level of the attribute it's connected to, and each level up gives you 1 new attribute point and 1 new skill point. So the more you raise your strength stat, the more you can raise the various strength skills. However, each attribute has at least some really useful skills attached to it, meaning you can't increase all the best skills because you'll be limited by your attributes. This works well and allows you to make different builds that have different strengths and weaknesses. And as well as getting to build your own character, you also get to level up your companions to build them through the same system. However, some skills are classed as party skills, meaning their effect is party-wide and only the highest rank of a party member matters, and so you can specialise different companions to give them different roles. But the problem with this is that through this you can effectively cover everything important by using companions to invest into each needed party skill and investing only into personal skills yourself. There is still room for individuality in the exact way you build your character, and it is quite satisfying to build the perfect party that covers everything, but it's still a bit too easy to just use your companions to effectively get everything you might need with no downsides, which ultimately diminishes the player choice involved, and any player who doesn't hyper-specialise their companions in this way is at a big disadvantage. Still, the skill system overall isn't bad, and getting to not only level up your own character, but also your companions as well, really adds to the already strong sense of progression inherent to the game. In addition to accumulating money, troops, and experience points, you'll also earn a variety of reputations through your actions. The most important of these is Renown, which is a representation of how well known you are within the game world, and is gained through victory in battle, with the harder the fight meaning the greater the Renown reward. Renown impacts the maximum size of your army, as well as being a requirement for several important in-game actions like becoming a noble. There's also Honour and Controversy, which affect how much and who will trust you, and finally there's also Reputation with individual lords. So your actions will impact a range of things, and these things can have future consequences later down the line. You don't need to know the ins and outs of these systems in great depth, but it's important that they exist. There are hundreds of lords in this game, who each have their own relationships and set personality types, as well as their own army, and as the 6 major factions war with each other, these lords can gain or lose land, as well as gain renown, or get captured or indicted for treason, or defect to a different faction. You could remove the player from the game, and the world would continue to function, with wars being won and lost and lords rising and falling. The game's economy is similarly impressive, with cities and villages changing in prosperity depending on trade, and prices of goods changing in relation to supply and demand. The effectiveness of Mount & Blade as a simulation is an aspect some people might underappreciate, but it's one of the reasons this game can be so fun for so long. Because underneath all the player's actions, there is some semblance of an independently existing and functional world that is changing and evolving. And it's up to you what kind of mark you want to leave on this world, which takes us into what I think of as the mid-game. After a period of roaming the land, picking up companions and testing your skills against common bandits, you might find yourself wanting a little more than what the road has to offer. Maybe you start thinking about getting some land of your own, or a taste of real war and the glory that comes with it, and it's at this point that you'll probably want to consider leaving the mercenary life behind to pledge your blade to one of the game's factions. Don't worry if you're not too sure which one, this decision isn't permanent and you can change your mind later, albeit at a cost to your reputation, but still entering into the service of one of the factions is the best way to start truly making a name for yourself. As for which faction to choose, Mount & Blade takes place in a fictional setting that's analogous to medieval Europe, and so you have a choice of the not Vikings, called the Nords, the not Western Europeans, called the Swadians, the not Eastern Europeans, called the Vegas, the not Mongols, called the Kyrgyz, the not Saracens, called the Saranid, and last but not least, the not Italians, called the Rhodoks. Why do the Italians get to have their own faction, you may wonder? Well, I don't really know, but I'm glad they do because they're my favourite, and you'll probably find you have your own preferences too. Considering the history and background details for each faction is actually very underdeveloped, you'll be surprised by how strong a personality each faction nevertheless manages to have, which is largely thanks to their similarity to their real-world counterparts, as well as the impact of different unit types. So pick your favourite, pledge your sword, and get ready for war. In Mount & Blade's wars, one lord per faction is elected as a marshal, which means they get to decide everything important. The marshal's first step is gathering the armies of the realm to their banner, which you get to be one of, and then you all march off into the distance in search of glory. Or, as is perhaps more likely, then you all march off into the distance and wander around for a bit, before either A, the marshal decides his army isn't big enough and goes home, or B, your armies actually end up somewhere they're supposed to be. At this point you change from wandering around to sitting around, and then the enemy army turns up and everyone runs away, and you better hope you are paying attention so you can start running in time too. Alternatively, the enemy might not get organised in time, meaning each of their lords will flail about individually in the background, while you get to participate in the siege. Siege battles take the best and worst parts of Mount & Blade's normal battles and turn them up a degree. So the spectacle is better than ever, with even more shouting, and everything looks and feels great. But in addition to this, the AI is also stupider than ever, with even more shouting, and it can all be a bit unbalanced. Attacking is done either for a slow but effective siege tower, or a few little ladders that someone has kindly already set up for you. Archers then cause devastation both to the attacking and defending side, and melee infantry will all rush the few available choke points, causing a great big mass of death and shouting. Really, it's quite exciting. Sometimes you get pushed off a ladder, which your troops really don't like letting you get back on, and sometimes you get stuck in the terrain, but for the most part it's exciting. Pushing through enemy lines and storming the walls feels great, but here you'll start to see the problem with the enemy AI, which is that they're often completely lacking in awareness and will all charge your main group of infantry, allowing the player to hack away at the enemy's backs to slaughter them by the droves. This makes things a bit too easy, or at least it would, if not for the presence of enemy archers, who can easily kill you before you even get to the walls, which seems a little unfair, particularly when you're against crossbowmen who can kill you in 2 hits, even when you're equipped with the highest quality armour. By contrast, normal enemies' melee attacks will barely scratch you, making you a melee god who can cut through enemies in the hundreds, but then you come across a couple of barely trained crossbowmen who can put you down in seconds, and you have almost no way of avoiding their shots. The only counter is to be ultra defensive, to stop your men from charging in and instead sit back and slowly pick off the enemy's ranged units with your own range to make things a little safer. And maybe this is realistic. I'm sure crossbows annoyed real-life armoured knights as well back in the day, but the speed at which enemy ranged units can kill you can be annoying, and being forced to play defensively every battle can get boring. And this is all made worse because of the fact that when you're knocked out, the assault is over, and your men pull back, forcing you to attack again from back outside the castle walls. This time with less starting health, meaning you'll be dead in 1 hit rather than 2. So if you do carefully pick off the enemy's ranged units, and then lead the charge to get a foothold on the walls before bravely fighting the enemy back into the streets, where things are more equal, and then you get hit by a lucky arrow and knocked unconscious, well, then it's over. Your men don't continue to fight a battle which numerically they should be able to easily win by this point. Instead, the fighting ends instantly, and you're back outside the enemy's walls, having to go through this all again, with the overall number of troops reduced a bit, but the on-field battle being exactly the same. If there's a small number of troops, you may have worn the enemy down, in which case things are fine, but there's often far larger numbers than can appear on the field of battle at one time, say 800 versus 300, so to actually win the battle you need to survive killing the entire 300 enemies in one go as new waves keep arriving while your health stays the same, and you'll always be dead in a few arrow hits. With the enemy range damage being as high as it is, this can become tedious and unfairly punishing. And siege defences also have their problems, although not because they're too difficult, but instead because they're too easy. As long as you're not too outnumbered, you can sit at a choke point in a place where enemy ranged units can't hit you, and then kill enemies as they try to get onto your walls, without ever really having to worry about taking damage. So, like with many parts of Mount & Blade, sieges aren't perfect. They're where the game's poor AI and balance show itself the clearest, but that still doesn't take away from how impressive they do look and feel. The first sieges you find yourself in really are memorable, and the flaws become easier to forgive when you consider how few games are able to replicate experiences anything like this. With your first siege successfully completed, you'll probably feel a bit of a high, and you might start to wonder who gets ownership of this new shiny piece of real estate. But, unfortunately, deciding that is a job for the faction ruler, and he won't be giving anything impressive to a lowly upstart like you. You will sooner or later be rewarded with your first village, however, and like any good landowner, this means you can now start making money off people less important than you through the magical concept of rent. If you want more than a rundown village, you'll probably have to take it yourself, which means getting a bigger army and taking a castle on your own, and then hoping your faction ruler is impressed enough by your efforts to let you keep your prize. For this you'll need a decent sized army, so you better keep making money and earning experience points and renown until you can field a real force to be reckoned with. Here you'll also start to notice that you can impact the fate of wars more than you might have initially realised. You see, once you start winning battles on your own, you can start capturing enemy lords, taking individual armies out of the equation, or if you don't get lucky enough to capture them, you'll at least be able to kill their troops and force them to go home and take some time to rebuild. So as you start to defeat more enemy lords, you'll likely notice the war efforts of your comrades going more smoothly. There'll be less running away and more running towards, and hopefully more land that one day might even be given to you. And as your reputation and experience grow, you can start to think about the late game, and whether you want to keep taking orders, or maybe start your own kingdom. It's worth repeating that Mount & Blade is an open-ended game, and you can follow your own route in your own way. If you want to stay loyal to your favourite faction, you can, and one day you'll hopefully be rewarded by being the one promoted to Marshal, at which point you can get to be the one making decisions, and you can ramp up the war efforts and show the other Marshals how it's done. You can also find various claimants to the different thrones of Calradia, who you can support to overthrow an existing faction, and then support this new ruler as their right-hand man. But if you don't like serving or sharing, you can of course declare yourself king and take what you want by force. Others might not like it, and you will have to fight for your place in the world, but if there's one thing you should know how to do by this point in time, it's fight. And so you can carve out your own kingdom with your own two hands, and let the bodies fall where they may. And by this point in your playthrough, you'll probably have invested many hours to get here. At the start of this video I mentioned that the journey matters in Mount & Blade, and that's partly because it takes so damn long. There will be lots of milestones from your time in Calradia: your first successful siege, being recognised as a noble, your first fief, your first castle, getting married, crowning yourself as king, and so on. And these milestones do matter, partly because they do take time, you do have to work for them, and you do have to climb your way up the ladder, taking each step at a time as you go from a nobody to a somebody to the somebody. But these milestones also matter because they're your milestones. They are the markers of your journey, a journey that'll be at least slightly different to anyone else's, and a journey where you've had the freedom at every step of the way to do what you want and make the experience your own. And that adds a lot of meaning. The story of Mount & Blade is your story, and it's not a bad one. However, it seems only fair to acknowledge that, like other parts of the game, the late game and kingdom management has some issues. Firstly, it needs to be said that Mount & Blade's progression, which is one of its strongest parts, does slow down towards the end. This is partly because things like leveling up or upgrading gear happen less frequently, but there's also the diminishing impact of army size. You see, you'll start the game with a handful of men, say 7 or 8, and quickly work your way up to a somewhat more respectable group of 20 or 30 that will grow with each victory until you get a decent sized army of 60 or 70. All this time you'll likely fight against similar sized oppositions, and so seeing battles go from 10v10 to 30v30 to 60v60 feels pretty satisfying. And then you'll reach the unit cap, which is 150 units on the field at a time, at which point your army will keep getting bigger, but the battles will stay the same size. This alone reduces the sense of progression in the game, but kingdom management also has quite a lot of busy work to it as well, such as managing your settlement's garrisons and dealing with your vassals. Vassals in particular can prove to be an issue, because while it does feel great to finally have some real lords following you, keeping the lords you enlist happy is not easy. Different lords have different personalities, so this means the first thing you should do is find a way to determine those personalities so you can only recruit the good ones, which is really only possible to do if you start the process early on in your playthrough. Still, even if you do carry out your homework and recruit only good boys, the numbers are still stacked against you. A good-natured or upstanding lord's reputation will decrease by 2 points every single time you give a fief to someone else. Their reputation will increase by 10 points every time you give a fief to them. So take a hypothetical example where you have 10 lords loyal to you. That means each time you reward someone you gain 10 reputation and lose 18. That's a net loss of 8 points every time you award someone land, and that's an example of only 10 lords and only lords with the best personalities, so the real situation will probably be a lot worse. When a lord's reputation does drop too low, they will defect, taking all their territory with them, so you can see the problem here. It's clear the developers want some lords to be unhappy to create drama and challenge in the late game, but there's just not enough depth to this system to make it enjoyable, so instead managing your vassals ends up feeling like a bit of a chore, which slows the already slow late game down. And on the subject of game speed, there aren't really any ways to speed things up if you do think the game progresses too slowly. This may not be a problem on your first playthrough, but on subsequent playthroughs the slow speed of a campaign might be off-putting. Without an actual way to speed your playthrough up, it means difficulty settings might be substituted instead, because if the game is easier, it takes less time. For example, if combat is easier, you won't need to wait as long to take on big enemy armies, and you won't have to worry as much about replacing lost troops, so you can progress faster. So, through the existing difficulty settings you can speed the game up, but it's at the cost of difficulty, which can weaken the gameplay. And a campaign speed option that makes a few simple changes like increased rates of experience and renown would be enough to provide players with the option of decreasing some of the tedium without sacrificing the difficulty of the core gameplay. So Mount & Blade Warband is a flawed game. Really, if you were to break the game down further, you could continue to find problems in most of its individual aspects, because when a game does so many different things, and provides the player with so many different options, it's not going to be able to ensure a consistently high level of quality across every part of the experience. But really that's fine, because that's the cost of making something so big and sprawling and ambitious. There were 2 quests on my recent playthrough that really stuck with me as representing what Mount & Blade is like. They were both prison rescue missions, where I snuck into an enemy city after bribing a nearby village to cause a distraction so I could rescue an imprisoned lord. In the first quest, I didn't remember what I was doing, and so was amazed at how smooth everything went. And then when I got inside the prison, I realised there wasn't just 1 captured lord inside here, but 4. This meant fighting our way back out with our superior numbers was a walk in the park, and when we had escaped, I didn't just get the usual reward, but also bonus reputation with 3 other lords, who were all important to me as we belonged to the same faction. So something I thought might turn out to be a disaster went far better than expected, with my reputation within my faction getting a substantial boost, and one of these lords would later even join me when I rebelled and declared my own independence, many days later. And then another time after this I did another rescue mission where I was saving one guy, and after the last experience I was confident in what I was doing and thinking this would be no problem, but then in the middle of the rescue mission the lord I was saving bugged out and attacked me. And as he wouldn't stop attacking me, I died. And if I didn't have autosaving turned off, which was only turned off to make getting footage for this video slightly easier, then I would have also ended up in prison myself, which is not a good place to be. Instead, I could save Scum to try to get around this, but no matter what I tried to get him to calm down, he kept being hostile, so after an hour or so, I just gave up. And yeah, that's Mount & Blade, a game which feels like anything can happen, for better or worse. But it's also a game where you have to accept the good and the bad, because as much bad as there is, the good overwhelmingly makes up for it. And so Mount & Blade is an odd mix of real-time action combat with RPG character building and strategy kingdom management, all inside a very open and deep sandbox. And it's great. It's a genuinely original and enjoyable game with a huge amount of things to do, but deserves every bit of praise it gets. And if the base game doesn't convince you, there's also expansions, multiplayer, and mods, of which, seeing as how long this video already is, I clearly don't have time to go into with any depth, but the mod scene in particular for Mount & Blade does need some recognition. This is a game with an incredibly impressive amount of high quality mods available. There are total conversion mods for a variety of settings, including Lord of the Rings, Warhammer, Historical Japan, Game of Thrones, The Wheel of Time, multiple original fantasy settings and multiple other historical settings. And then there's other mods which enhance the base game, the best known of which is the Floris mod, which adds a huge amount of improvements while trying to preserve the base experience, as well as plenty of other mods, some of which are still being updated and releasing today. And while for some games, modders have a hard time matching the level of presentation of the base game, which can make mods feel slightly amateur and like cheap knockoffs, Mount & Blade's presentation is instead already very simple. It's a difficult task for a modder to replicate high quality story scenes with professional voice acting and handcrafted animations, but something like changing character models and redoing menus is much more achievable. So Mount & Blade's basic presentation can actually work in its favour here to allow high quality ambitious mods that keep the core of the combat and gameplay systems, but add a completely fresh coat of paint to make new experiences that work far better than they should. And so with mods, Mount & Blade goes from a game with a large amount of content to a game that is almost endlessly playable. So maybe it's no surprise that 10 years later its fanbase is still going strong. And now, in a couple of weeks in fact, the sequel will finally be released. Albeit in early access, but still, it will be an actual game that people can buy and play. Which is a weird thought. To describe Bannerlord as long awaited is a bit of an understatement. When making this video I saw plenty of comments of people getting impatient at how long it was taking, and some of those comments were 7 years old. And if people were getting impatient 7 years ago, you can imagine what's happened in the meantime. But Bannerlord will tell its own story, and really, I don't know whether it will live up to expectations and be worth the wait. I suppose we'll find out soon enough. But in the meanwhile, I think it's worth recognising Mount & Blade Warband itself, and just how much this game really did achieve. Alright, seriously, this is excessive shouting.